betrayal, deception, revenge. What you're about to hear is not fiction. I'm Booze, Nguyen, and every video on this channel is a confession, a scar, a buried truth. Subscribe if you're brave enough to hear the whole story. The flight home, the hum of the engines had always calmed me, until today. Somewhere between Michigan and New York, as the clouds rolled beneath me like gray ghosts, I realized I wasn't flying home. I was flying into a battlefield. My father Tran Lavu was gone. It still didn't sound real, even after the call from his lawyer, even after I saw his name on the news ticker at the bottom of the screen. Billionaire real estate magnate Tran Lavu dies at 68. They said it like he was a headline, not a man, not a father. I had been his son for 31 years. But most of those years, I'd been nothing more than a shadow on the edge of his life. A secret whispered in the corridors of his empire. My mother used to say, "Tony, your father is like the moon. Everyone can see him, but only a few ever feel his warmth." Now that warmth was gone. The flight attendant passed by offering drinks. I waved her off. My whiskey from earlier still sat half empty, sweating on the tray. I caught my reflection in the small oval window, tired eyes, a face too much like his. The same sharp jawline, the same stubborn mouth. My mother used to say it was both a blessing and a curse. She had met him when she was a junior broker at one of his real estate firms. He was already married then, to the woman who would become my stepmother, though she never once acknowledged me as part of the family. To her, my mother was the mistake that almost ruined a dynasty. And maybe in their eyes, that's exactly what I was. The captain announced our descent into New York. I glanced down at the skyline I'd grown up watching from afar. My father built half those towers, steel, glass, and pride stacked into the clouds. Vu Holdings. His empire wasn't just a business. It was his life's monument. And now somehow it had fallen to me. Or at least that's what the lawyer said on the phone. I didn't quite believe it. Not yet. When the plane landed, I gathered my single carry-on. No entourage, no assistant, no security detail. Just me, and a quiet ache in my chest. Outside the arrival gate, there were no family members waiting. No cameras, no condolences. Only Mr. Raymond. My father's personal lawyer for 20 years stood holding a small sign that read, "Mr. Tony Tran." He looked the same as I remembered, polished, polite, and unreadable. "Mr. Tran," he greeted, extending a hand. "My condolences." "Thank you," I said, shaking it firmly. His grip was dry, professional. Was anyone else supposed to come? Raymond's eyes flickered just briefly. "The family has gathered at the estate. They thought it would be best to wait there." Right. They didn't want me seen with them in public. Some things never change. We rode in silence through the city my father had conquered. From the back seat, I watched the towers pass by. The Vu Financial Center, the Levu Plaza, the Tran Metropolitan Residences, all gleaming testaments to a man who had come to America with nothing but ambition and ended up buying half of Manhattan. I wanted to feel proud. Instead, I felt small. Raymond's phone buzzed once. He didn't answer it, but I caught a glimpse of the screen, Ethan Vu. My older brother. Or half-brother, as they like to remind me. "Does Ethan know I'm coming?" I asked. Raymond hesitated. "Yes, the entire family is aware. They're expecting you." "Expecting me," I repeated quietly. "Or preparing for me." He didn't answer. When the car finally turned off the main road and into the gated driveway of the Vu estate, my stomach tightened. The mansion was more like a museum than a home. 3 stories of marble glass and old money perched on a cliff overlooking the Hudson. I'd been here only twice before, once as a child when my father had briefly tried to introduce me to the family, and once when my mother passed away. Both times had ended badly. Now I was back for his funeral and his will. The front doors opened before we reached them. Ethan stood there, tall and immaculate, in a black suit that probably cost more than my car. His expression was polite, cold, the kind reserved for strangers. Beside him was Lucas, the second son, slightly younger but sharper, like a blade still being honed. And then there was Isabel, the youngest. She hovered behind them in a simple black dress, her long dark hair loose. When she saw me, her eyes softened, just a little. "Tony," she said quietly, stepping forward, "I'm glad you came." That made one of them. "Isabel," I said, managing a smile. "It's good to see you." Ethan's jaw tightened. "We weren't sure if you'd make it." "I wouldn't miss it," I replied. He was my father, too. A heavy silence hung between us, the kind filled with unspoken history. Lucas smirked. "Right, your father." I didn't take the bait, not yet. Raymond cleared his throat. "If we could go inside. The reading of the will is scheduled for this afternoon." Inside, the air smelled of lilies and expensive wood polish. Every portrait, every sculpture, every polished surface screamed legacy. My father's presence lingered in every corner. His favorite decanter on the side table, his leather chair by the fireplace, the faint trace of his cologne that hadn't yet faded. We gathered in the grand hall where a long mahogany table stretched beneath a chandelier the size of a small car. The seats were arranged neatly, Ethan at one end, Lucas beside him, Isabel in the middle. I took the last chair at the far side, the one nobody seemed to want. Raymond opened his briefcase, pulling out a thick envelope sealed with my father's signature wax mark. My pulse quickened. This, he said formally, is the last will and testament of Mr. Tran Lavu, signed and witnessed 3 weeks before his passing. 3 weeks. That close to the end. He knew he was dying and he didn't call me. Raymond began reading. The first part was predictable. Tributes, charitable donations, funeral requests. Then came the inheritance. To my eldest son, Ethan Tran Lavu, Raymond read, I bequeath ownership of the 57th Street penthouse and the 5th Avenue townhouse. Ethan nodded slightly as if it were a formality. To my second son, Lucas Tran Lavu, Raymond continued, I bequeath the Central Park residence and the Tribeca investment property. Lucas smirked, as expected, and to my beloved daughter, Isabel, Lavu Raymond said, I grant full ownership of the seaside villa in Maui, Hawaii. Isabel blinked in surprise. Dad really did that. Raymond smiled faintly. He did. He said you always loved the ocean. Her eyes glistened. He remembered. Then Raymond paused. I could feel the air shift. And finally, he said, his voice firm, to my son Tony Tran, I entrust full control and executive authority over VU Holdings International, including all subsidiary assets and voting shares. For a second, nobody breathed. The silence shattered like glass. What Ethan's voice was sharp. That's impossible. Lucas pushed his chair back. That's a mistake. Raymond remained calm. It's no mistake, Mr. Vu was explicit. Tony is to assume the position of CEO effective immediately upon my authorization. Ethan stood up, his face red. He's not even a real Vu. He's the son of a mistress. Watch your mouth, I said quietly. Or what he spat. You'll sue us. You think you can walk in here and steal what our father built? What we built? Raymond intervened, holding up the document. Gentlemen, this is a legally binding testament. Lucas slammed his hand on the table. Then it's a forged one. No way our father would leave everything to him. Isabel rose from her seat. Enough. This isn't what Dad wanted. He hated fighting. Her voice trembled, but her words carried weight. For the first time, both brothers fell silent. Ethan glared at me across the table. You'll regret this, he said. We'll have the will contested, every clause, every signature. Raymond folded the document. You're entitled to do that, but it will take months, perhaps years. And in the meantime, Tony remains acting CEO. The brothers stormed out. Isabel stayed behind. For a moment, the house was quiet again, except for the ticking of a grandfather clock and the distant rumble of thunder outside. She turned to me. I don't know what's happening, Tony, but I believe Dad had his reasons. I looked at her, seeing traces of our father's gentleness in her eyes. Thank you, I said. That means more than you know. But even as I said it, I felt the first stirrings of something darker inside me, a sense that this was only the beginning. I could already see the outlines of war forming in the shadows of the Vu estate. They would come for me, for the company, for the truth. And I was ready. For the first time in my life, I had something worth fighting for, the will of the dead. The storm outside broke just as the meeting ended. Thunder rolled through the mansion, echoing down marble halls like an omen. I sat there long after everyone left. Just me, the ticking clock, and the lawyer's empty chair. Rain streaked the windows, distorting the city lights in the distance. For the first time since landing, I felt the weight of what had just happened. I was now the CEO of VU Holdings International. On paper, at least. In reality, I'd inherited something far more dangerous, a legacy built on secrets and a family ready to destroy me for it. I pressed my hands together, trying to steady them. The seal of the will still burned in my mind, my father's signature firm and deliberate. He'd known exactly what he was doing. But why me? Why the son he'd barely acknowledged? A soft voice broke my thoughts. You're still here. I turned. Isabel stood at the doorway, her dress catching the faint glow of the chandelier. She'd changed out of her black mourning clothes, and now looked younger, vulnerable. Nothing like the steel-hearted brothers who had stormed out earlier. I couldn't sleep, I said. You. She walked closer, arms folded. They're furious. Ethan's already calling his lawyers. Lucas is talking to shareholders. They think if they can freeze the company accounts, they can stop you before you even begin. Of course they are, I muttered. They're not used to losing. Tony. She hesitated, lowering her voice. They're not just angry, they're scared. Dad trusted you more than any of us in the end, and that terrifies them. I studied her face, searching for deceit, but all I saw was exhaustion. She meant it. I don't know what Dad told you before he died, I said, but he never said a word to me. Not even a hint. She shook her head slowly. He didn't tell me anything either. But he had a file he kept hidden in his private study. He told me once if anything ever happened to him that the truth would protect the right person. The truth, I frowned. About what? Her eyes dropped. About you. The room went still. Before I could ask more, she turned toward the hall. You'll find it in the safe behind his portrait in the study. But be careful, Tony, you're not the only one looking. Then she left her heels echoing down the marble corridor until they disappeared into silence. The study. I found the portrait easily. My father in his prime standing before the skyline of Manhattan he'd helped create. Behind it, as Isabel said, there was a small biometric safe. I placed my hand on the scanner, not expecting much. The screen blinked once, then turned green. Access granted. A cold shiver ran down my spine. He'd added my prints. Inside, I found a single brown folder marked Private TT. I opened it on the desk under the dim light. Inside were several documents. Bank ledgers, internal memos, and letters, each marked confidential. But one stood out, a handwritten note addressed to me. Tony, if you're reading this, then my time has come. I know I've not been the father you deserved, but I've watched you from afar. You have your mother's integrity and her fire. What I built with my blood. But not all of it was clean. The company has enemies. Some wear suits and sit in boardrooms. Some share our last name. You must protect what's yours. What's ours? Trust no one. Father. I read it 3 times before folding it back into the envelope. My father's words were a warning and a confession. Trust no one. Not even Isabel. A noise from outside the door made me freeze. Footsteps, slow, heavy, then silence. I slipped the folder back into the safe, closed it, and turned off the light. When I opened the door, the hallway was empty, but the faint scent of cigarette smoke lingered in the air. Ethan smoked, always had. The meeting. The next morning, I arrived at VU Holdings headquarters, a glass fortress in the heart of Manhattan. Every eye in the lobby followed me as I walked past. Some recognized me from the news. Others just sensed the shift in power. The boardroom on the 42nd floor was already full. 15 directors, men and women who had served under my father for decades, sat in silence as I entered. At the far end sat Richard Hahn, the CFO, my father's oldest ally. His eyes were kind but tired. Mr. Tran, he greeted. On behalf of the board, our condolences, and congratulations. Thank you, I said, taking my seat. The room smelled of money and fear. Ethan and Lucas weren't members of the board, but both had influence here. They had friends, shareholders, and executives who owed them favors. I knew walking into this room was like walking into a den of wolves. Richard cleared his throat. We've reviewed the legal transition documents. Until the contesting claim is settled, you have interim control of the company. However, there are concerns. Concerns, I asked evenly. One of the directors, a woman named Marjorie Leon, leaned forward. The markets reacted poorly to the will announcement. Stock dropped 6% overnight. Investors are uncertain about your leadership given your limited public record. Another director added, we've also received notice that Ethan and Lucas are calling an emergency shareholders meeting to challenge your authority. I smiled thinly. They move fast. Richard sighed. They always did. But you have legal right, Tony. For now, you're in charge. What you do next will determine whether the company stands or collapses. I looked around the table at the people who had served my father for years. None of them truly trusted me yet. But they were watching, weighing me, testing if I was weak. I took a deep breath. Then let's get to work. The trap. By noon, I had already gone through 4 departments, signed 6 emergency memos, and discovered that nearly every senior executive was more loyal to my brothers than to me. When I asked for the company's internal audit files, the accounting chief looked uneasy. We're still compiling them, sir. Compiling, I said. They should be up to date. He hesitated. We haven't received full reports since last quarter. I leaned forward. Last quarter was 5 months ago. He swallowed. Your father had suspended the audit process. Confidential directive. Only Mr. Ethan had access. There it was, the first shadow. Something about this company wasn't clean. Something my father had tried to hide. And maybe Ethan had continued to bury. I dismissed the man and called Raymond, the lawyer. I need everything you can find about the company's offshore accounts and restricted investments, I told him. My father left a note suggesting there were irregularities. He paused on the line. Irregularities. Illegal ones, I said quietly. The confrontation. That night, I returned to my hotel suite overlooking the city. I hadn't slept in 36 hours. My head was pounding from exhaustion and anger. When I walked into the living room, someone was already there. Ethan. He was sitting in the dark cigarette smoke curling around his silhouette. "You should lock your door," he said coolly. "New York's dangerous." I didn't flinch. "Breaking and entering suits you." He smiled faintly. "You always had a sharp tongue." "Mom used to say bastards inherit bad manners." "Funny," I said. "Dad used to say firstborns inherit bad habits." He laughed once, a cold, humorless sound. "You think you won today. But this company doesn't belong to you. It never will. You're a placeholder, a mistake Dad tried to fix with a pen." "He made his choice," I said. "You can't change that." Ethan stood crushing his cigarette in the ashtray. "Maybe not with a pen," he said, stepping close. "But there are other ways." I met his stare. For a moment I saw it, the same ambition that had driven my father, only twisted, consumed by envy. He leaned closer. "You want to keep that seat, little brother? You'd better be ready to bleed for it." Then he walked out, leaving the faint smell of smoke and cologne behind. The file. At 2 a.m. my phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. "Check your father's old property in Queens. Basement. 4186 Ash Street." No signature. I stared at it for a long time before grabbing my coat. The address led to an old, abandoned warehouse my father had bought years ago under one of his smaller subsidiaries. The lock was rusted, the lights flickering. Inside, the air was thick with dust and silence. In the basement, I found a row of metal filing cabinets. Most were empty, except one. Inside were folders marked Project Halcyon, blueprints, offshore bank transfers, shell companies, names of politicians, lobbyists, and executives, and my father's signature on every page. But one line stood out, scrawled in his handwriting across the margin. "If I fall, they will come for him next." I froze. They? Who were they? The faint sound of footsteps echoed above. Someone else was in the building. I closed the folder, slipped one file under my jacket, and moved silently toward the exit. When I reached the stairs, I saw a shadow move past the doorway. Tall, fast, deliberate. Then a voice I recognized too well. "Looking for something, Tony?" "Lucas." He stepped into the light, smiling, not kindly. "You shouldn't dig into things Dad buried," he said, pulling a gun from his coat. "You might not like what you find." The wolves of Manhattan. For a moment I couldn't breathe. Lucas's gun gleamed under the flickering basement light. Steady, deliberate. His expression was calm, too calm, like he'd rehearsed this moment 100 times. "Put the file down, Tony," he said. "You don't know what you're holding." My pulse hammered in my ears. The old cement walls seemed to close in around us. "You planning to shoot me over a few papers?" I asked. He smiled thinly. "Not over papers, over what they mean." I stepped back slowly, measuring the distance between us. "You really think Dad would have wanted this a war between his sons?" Lucas's eyes flickered with something I couldn't name. Anger, regret, fear. "Dad made his choice when he brought you into this world. You think Ethan's the only one who wants you gone? You don't belong here, Tony. You never did." I saw his finger twitch on the trigger. That was all the warning I needed. I threw the folder to the side. It hit the floor, scattering papers like snow. Lucas's gaze flicked instinctively toward it, and in that split second I lunged forward. The gun went off, loud, deafening. The shot missed, hitting a steel beam behind me. Sparks flew. We crashed against the file cabinets, metal clanging hands grappling for the gun. Lucas was stronger, but I was faster. I slammed my elbow into his ribs, twisted his wrist, and the weapon clattered across the floor. He swung at me, connecting with my jaw. Pain exploded across my face, but adrenaline drove me forward. I shoved him into the wall, pinning him there. "Tell me what Project Halcyon is," I hissed. He spat blood. "You really don't know, do you?" He laughed. A cold, broken sound. "Our father wasn't the man you thought he was. Halcyon isn't a project, it's a cover." "For what?" But before he could answer, headlights flared through the grimy basement windows. 2 cars pulling up outside. Men's voices echoed through the stairwell. "Shit," Lucas muttered. "They're early." I backed away, chest heaving. "Who's early?" He didn't answer. Instead, he wiped the blood from his mouth, gave me a strange, almost pitying look, and said, "Run." I didn't wait to ask twice. The escape. I bolted up the stairs and out through a side exit as the front door burst open behind me. Voices shouted. Men armed, organized. Someone fired. The bullet shattered a window inches from my head. I dove behind a rusted dumpster and sprinted toward the alley, the file clutched against my chest. Rain fell hard, blurring the neon reflections on the wet asphalt. Tires screeched. One of the men spotted me and yelled, "There!" He's got it! I ran until my lungs burned, cutting through narrow streets, ducking behind cars. When I finally reached the main road, I flagged down a passing cab. Downtown. Fast, I barked, throwing myself inside. The driver didn't ask questions. New York cabbies rarely did. As the city lights blurred by, I looked down at the torn folder in my lap. Half the pages were soaked from the rain, but one detail still stood out. Project Halcyon, Phase 4, Financial Reconstruction Operations. Beneath it, several offshore bank codes, each linked to companies I'd never heard of, but all tracing back to VU Holdings. My father had been moving money, billions, through shell corporations across Asia and the Caribbean. And from the dates, it looked recent, too recent. He'd known he was dying, yet he was still shifting money. Why? And who were the men chasing me tonight? I felt a chill creep down my spine. My father's note came back to me: if I fall, they will come for him next. Now I knew who him was, me. The Office of Shadows. I reached the office building just before dawn. Only one light was on, the corner office that used to be my father's. When I stepped inside, I wasn't alone. Richard Hahn, the CFO, was there, his sleeves rolled up, coffee steaming on the desk. He looked startled when he saw me. "Tony, what the hell happened to you?" "Lucas tried to kill me," I said bluntly. "And someone else wants me dead too." Richard froze. "What are you talking about?" I tossed the soaked folder onto his desk. "Do you know what Project Halcyon is?" He stared at the documents, color draining from his face. "Where did you get this?" "Doesn't matter. Tell me what it is." He hesitated, then sighed heavily, removing his glasses. "It's complicated. Halcyon started years ago during the 2008 crash. Your father made deals, quiet ones, with government officials, foreign investors, and some less legal entities. He used shell companies to move money offshore to keep the business alive. It saved the empire, but it wasn't clean. I felt my stomach turn, so he laundered money. Richard didn't deny it. Call it strategic preservation. But there's more. Halcyon wasn't just about hiding assets. It was about owning the people who helped hide them. Judges, bankers, politicians, they all owed him favors. That's why the company could never fall. I paced the room, and now those same people are scared. With your father gone, they don't trust anyone new, least of all you. If you expose this, they burn. If you bury it, they control you. I stared at him, realization dawning. That's what Lucas meant. They're early. He wasn't talking about Ethan. He meant these people, the ones behind Halcyon. Richard nodded grimly. And if they think you'll open your father's files, they'll kill you. The offer. At noon, Ethan called. "Little brother," he said, voice slick as oil. "Busy day. What do you want?" He chuckled. "Let's not pretend. You have something that belongs to us. Hand it over. The Halcyon files. And maybe we can negotiate your exit with dignity. Maybe even a severance package. Say, a few million to disappear." I let the silence stretch before answering. "You think this is about money? Everything is about money," he said softly. "That's the first lesson Dad ever taught us." "No," I said. "That's the lesson that killed him." I hung up. The betrayal. That night I met Isabel again. This time at a quiet cafe in Soho. She looked shaken, eyes red from crying. "They're saying you stole from the company," she said. "Ethan's been feeding stories to the press. He's calling you unstable, reckless. That Dad regretted leaving you in charge." I clenched my jaw. Typical. "There's more," she said, sliding her phone across the table. It was an email chain from Richard Hahn to Ethan VU subject Halcyon contingency. "He has the file. I'll deliver it tonight." My stomach dropped. "Richard?" "I found it on Dad's old server," she whispered. "You can't trust anyone, Tony. He's playing both sides." I stood chair scraping against the floor. "Then I'll end it tonight." The Wolf's Den. At midnight, I walked back into the VU Holdings tower. The security guards barely looked at me. They still thought I was the boss. Richard was in his office just as the email said. He didn't even look surprised when I entered. "I was wondering when you'd show," he said quietly. "Why?" I asked. "After everything Dad did for you?" He sighed. "Your father saved my career, yes, but he also doomed me. Halcyon isn't just money, Tony. It's people. Powerful ones. You think you can fight them, you'll end up in the river. So you sold me out." "I kept the company alive," he snapped. "Do you even understand what you're holding? If those files go public, every deal your father ever made collapses. The empire burns. Thousands lose their jobs." I stepped closer. "Then maybe it should burn." He looked at me then, really looked at me. And I saw fear in his eyes. "You sound just like your mother." That stopped me cold. "What did you say?" He hesitated, then whispered, "Your mother didn't die in an accident, Tony." She was silenced. She found out about Halcyon and threatened to expose it. Your father tried to protect her, but it was too late. The room spun. No, she was killed by the same people who are coming for you. Before I could respond, glass shattered. A gunshot cracked through the office window. Richard jerked forward, a red bloom spreading across his shirt. I dropped behind the desk as more bullets tore through the glass. Outside, shadows moved across the rooftop. Richard's last words gurgled through blood. Run. Find the ledger. Brooklyn. Warehouse 19. Then he went still. The awakening. I ran again. Out the service stairwell, down 42 flights into the storm. Sirens wailed in the distance. The night smelled of rain and gunpowder. When I finally stopped under the neon glow of a streetlight, I was shaking. But something inside me had changed. They killed my mother. They killed my father. And now they wanted to erase me. But I wasn't running anymore. If they wanted a war, I'd give them one. I looked up at the glowing VU holding sign on the skyscraper above. The empire that had destroyed everything I loved. The wolves of Manhattan, that's what they were. And I was done being their prey. The night I found my mother's photograph, the city was asleep. Manhattan's skyline blinked faintly through the glass walls of my penthouse, casting fractured reflections on the marble floor. I hadn't slept for 2 days. My mind was a knot of names, numbers, and faces. Lawyers, board members, and brothers who wanted to carve my life apart piece by piece. But none of that compared to the single envelope that sat on my desk. It was sealed with red wax stamped with the initials TLV, my father's. I stared at it for hours before I opened it. Inside was a single letter, and behind it a photograph. The photo was old, taken sometime in the 1990s. My father stood beside a woman, both smiling under a golden sunset somewhere near the Hudson. She wore a red dress, her black hair catching the light, her hand resting on his chest. I didn't need to look twice to know. It was my mother. But there was something else. Behind them, blurred but visible, was a tall man in a gray suit. The same man who had been watching me at my father's funeral. The same man who had followed my car 3 nights ago. And written in my father's handwriting on the back of the photo were 6 words: trust no one, not even family. The next morning I went to see Hannah. She opened the door to her Manhattan apartment in a white robe, her hair still wet from the shower. The moment she saw my face, her smile faded. "Tony," she said softly, "you look like you've seen a ghost." "Maybe I have," I replied. I handed her the photograph. "Do you know who that man is?" She studied it for a moment, then frowned. "That's Uncle Min, I think. Dad's old friend from the company. He used to come to the house when I was little. Then he just disappeared." Disappeared. She nodded. "Dad told everyone he retired and moved to Europe. But Mom once said she saw him outside the office years later, looking like he hadn't aged a day." A chill ran down my spine. There was something about my father's generation, his friends, his business partners, that no one ever talked about. They had built an empire out of shadows using dummy corporations, political ties, offshore accounts. My father had been the face of VU Group, but behind him, there had always been others. Men who didn't want to be seen. And now one of them was watching me. Later that week, I met with my father's personal lawyer again. Mr. Grant, a man who looked like he'd been carved from cold marble. "I found this among my father's belongings," I said, placing the envelope on his desk. "Do you know what it means?" Grant adjusted his glasses, scanning the letter. His face didn't move, but his eyes flickered. "This handwriting," he said, "finally wasn't written recently. I'd estimate 15 years ago, before VU Group went public. So he knew something back then." Grant hesitated. "Mr. Tran, your father was not only a businessman, he was also a survivor. There were forces within the company that wanted him gone long before his death." "What kind of forces?" "The kind that use family as leverage." He pushed the letter back to me. "If you want the truth, find out what happened to your mother. Everything begins there." That night I drove to Queens. The small house where my mother had lived before she died still stood, quiet, fading, the paint chipped like forgotten memories. I hadn't been there since I was a teenager. The air inside smelled of old perfume and paper. Her old piano still sat by the window, covered with dust. On the piano there was a jewelry box, one I remembered clearly. She used to let me play with it when I was little, saying every melody hides a secret. When I opened it, a soft tune played, a lullaby I hadn't heard in years. But beneath the false bottom, there was a small USB drive. I took it back to this penthouse. When I plugged it into my laptop, dozens of files appeared: scanned documents, contracts, voice recordings. Most of them dated back to the early 2000s. And then a video, labeled simply VU Group, Internal Meeting 2006. I clicked it. The footage was grainy but clear enough. My father sat at the head of a long table. Around him were men in suits, executives I'd only heard about, some of them long dead. And beside him, standing silently, was the same man in the gray suit. My father's voice came through calm but tense. "I've done everything you asked," he said. "The mergers, the accounts, the offshore transfers. But I will not fake another contract." One of the men leaned forward. "You think you have a choice? This company was built on my name," my father snapped. "And one day my son will inherit it." The man in gray whispered something to him. My father went silent. Then the screen went black. For several minutes, I just sat there. The sound of my heartbeat filled the room. It wasn't about the money. It was about power and who truly owned VU Group. The next day, I called Hannah. "We need to meet," I said. "I found something." When she arrived, I showed her the video. She watched it in silence, her face pale. "Tony? This means Dad wasn't in control." "Exactly. Someone else was pulling the strings." She looked at me, her eyes wet. "Then they might have killed him." I nodded slowly. "And we're next." Over the following week, everything began to unravel. Our family's private lawyer stopped returning calls. Several board members resigned without explanation. The press began publishing rumors that VU Group's stock was being manipulated. And then one night a car followed me again. This time I didn't drive home. I led them to the edge of Brooklyn, down a dead-end street near the docks. When the car stopped, I got out first. A man stepped out of the vehicle. Tall, gray suit face, calm as stone. "You've been looking for me?" he said. "Who are you?" He smiled faintly. "You can call me Min." The name hit me like ice. "You knew my father." "I built his empire," he said, "and I can destroy it just as easily." "Did you kill him?" He shook his head. "No, Tony. Your father killed himself the day he betrayed us. He thought leaving everything to you would save the company, but it only made you a target." He took a step closer. "Give me what's on that USB and I'll make sure you walk away alive." I stared at him. "And if I don't, then you'll end up like your mother." My blood froze. "What did you say?" He smiled. "You really think she died of a stroke?" My hands clenched. Every part of me wanted to strike him right there, but I forced myself to stay still. Instead, I said, "You'll get your USB tomorrow." He nodded once and left. The moment his car disappeared, I called Hannah. "Pack your things," I said. "We're leaving tonight." That night, as we drove out of Manhattan, Hannah looked at me through the dim car light. "Where are we going?" "To finish what Father started," I said. "We're going to Michigan." "Why Michigan?" I looked at her. "Because that's where the real Will is hidden. And the truth about who killed him." She went quiet for a long moment, then whispered, "Tony, are we going to survive this?" I didn't answer. I just pressed harder on the gas, the city fading in the rearview mirror like a dying star. The road to Michigan was long, quiet, and heavy with ghosts. The headlights carved narrow tunnels through the darkness as Hannah slept beside me, her head resting against the window. Her breath fogged the glass, and for the first time in weeks, she looked peaceful, untouched by the greed and violence that had swallowed our family whole. But I couldn't sleep. Not when every mile brought me closer to the truth. Somewhere out there, beyond the fields and frozen lakes, my father had hidden something. A final message, a secret buried so deep that even death couldn't silence it. And Min, he wanted it destroyed. The USB drive sat in my jacket pocket, warm from the heat of my body as if it were alive. I'd made 2 copies of its contents. One locked in an encrypted cloud and another mailed anonymously to a journalist I trusted in Chicago. If I didn't make it through the night, someone would. We reached Michigan just before dawn. The old estate stood like a fossil from another life. Massive iron gates, a house framed by black trees, the air still thick with my father's presence. When I was a boy, he used to bring me here during the summers. It was the only place where he didn't seem like a businessman. He'd walk barefoot in the grass, hum old Vietnamese folk songs, and tell me stories about a boy who wanted to build a world big enough to hide his pain. Now that boy was buried 6 feet under the ground, and I was standing in the ruins of his dream. Inside the house, everything was covered in white sheets. The air smelled like dust and time. Hannah followed me quietly as I searched the study, the library, the old piano room. Nothing. Then in the corner of my father's office, I noticed a loose floorboard beneath his desk. When I pried it open, I found a small steel box. Inside were papers, contracts, deeds, letters, and a leather-bound notebook. I opened it. The first page began with his handwriting. "If you're reading this, Tony, it means they've finally done what I always feared. I've left the company in your name not because you were my favorite son, but because you're the only one who still sees me as a man, not a bank account." I swallowed hard. The next pages detailed his suspicions about Min and the Board of 5, a secret group of investors who controlled major assets through shell companies. They weren't just businessmen. They were politicians, bankers, even law enforcement officials. They made me rich, then trapped me in their web. When I tried to break free, they threatened your mother. I thought I could protect her, but I failed. The last page stopped mid-sentence. If something happens to me, the ink trailed off, and at the bottom of the page, a smear of dried blood. Hannah gasped softly behind me. Tony, what do we do now? I closed the notebook. We finish it. I took out my phone and dialed Min's number. He answered on the first ring. You have something for me. Yes, I said. Meet me at my father's estate, alone. He laughed quietly. You're either very brave or very stupid. Maybe both. He arrived that evening just as the sun dipped below the trees. His black car rolled up the gravel path, headlights cutting through the fog. Two men stepped out behind him, bodyguards. I said alone, I reminded him. He smiled, and I said alive. He gestured for his men to stay near the car. Show me the drive. I held it up between my fingers. Before I do, I want to know the truth. Did you kill my father? He studied me for a long time. Your father killed himself, Tony. The moment he thought he could defy us. He overdosed on sleeping pills the night before his board meeting. I only made sure his company didn't die with him. I shook my head. Liar. He smiled faintly. Believe what you want. But if you want to keep your sister alive, you'll give me that USB right now. Behind him, one of his men suddenly pressed a hand to his earpiece. Sir, someone's coming. A moment later, bright lights flared through the trees. Dozens of vehicles, police sirens. Min turned sharply toward me. What the hell did you do? I smirked. Remember that journalist I mentioned? He got a copy of the files? So did the FBI. His face hardened. You made a mistake, boy. You don't understand what you've unleashed. I stepped closer. No, Min. You don't understand what my father unleashed. He built this empire with his hands, and now it ends with mine. I dropped the USB drive at his feet. Here's your proof. Before he could react, I stepped back. It's empty. Then the floodlights hit us. An agent swarmed the driveway shouting commands. Min's men drew their guns, but they were outnumbered. Within seconds, they were on the ground, handcuffed. Min didn't resist. He simply stared at me with cold, burning hatred. You think you've won, he said quietly. But power doesn't die. It just changes hands. As the agents dragged him away, I leaned close to his ear. Then I'll make sure it never finds new ones. The next morning, the world changed. News of the arrests exploded across every network. Hidden accounts, illegal property transfers, bribery. Vu Group's shadow empire laid bare. My father's name was both vindicated and destroyed in the same breath. The company's stock collapsed. The board dissolved. And I, once the invisible son, became the man who burned his own inheritance to the ground. But for the first time in my life, I felt free. A month later, I returned to New York. The penthouse was quiet now, stripped of the expensive art and the servants who'd once filled it with empty chatter. Hannah sat by the window reading one of father's notebooks. Do you ever regret it? She asked. I looked out at the city. Regret what? Destroying everything he built. I thought for a long moment before answering. He built it on lies. I just gave him the ending he couldn't. She closed the book and smiled faintly. Then maybe you're more like him than you think. I turned to her. I hope not. That night I went to my father's grave. The wind was cold, the ground damp with rain. I knelt beside the headstone and placed the notebook on it. I did it, Dad, I whispered. They can't hurt anyone anymore. For a long time, I just sat there listening to the wind move through the trees. Then I pulled a pen from my coat pocket and opened the notebook to the last page, the one he never finished. Under his words, I wrote, if something happens to me, my son will finish it. Then I signed my name beneath his. The last signature. 3 months later, I walked into the modest office of a new foundation I'd started. The VU Integrity Trust, dedicated to investigating corporate corruption. People called me crazy for giving away the remnants of my fortune. But I wasn't trying to be a saint. I just wanted to turn the ashes of my father's empire into something that meant something again. Before I left for the day, I looked out the window. The skyline glowed under the evening sun, the towers casting long shadows across the city. Power was still out there, crawling through the veins of every skyscraper, whispering promises to men who would never be satisfied. But it no longer owned me. And as I walked into the fading light, I thought of my father's words one last time. Trust no one, not even family. Maybe he was right. Or maybe, just maybe, trust wasn't something to be inherited. It was something you had to rebuild from the wreckage. I'm Booz, and Gwen, and these are real stories, told by those who lived them. Subscribe, if you're ready for the next truth. If this story made you think twice, hit that subscribe button. The next one might just break you. Thanks for staying till the end. Every week, I uncover another story the world tried to forget.